I don't know. I think there are parallels with the gender wars. People who think that they are right don't bother to look beyond their noses or analyze anything because they're right.
Yeah.
They disregard or they distort any evidence which does not support the view that they are right. So all I can imagine is the person carrying out this investigation started off from the premise that there was absolutely no problem. It was just a bunch of angry men complaining, and everything flowed from that.
On the 9th of May 2023, the UK's broadcasting regulator Ofcom confirmed it had concluded all considerations into complaints about shocking media bias in a Channel 4 documentary, including the misrepresentation of fathers in family court disputes. Torn Apart, Family Courts Uncovered was originally broadcast 659 days earlier on July 20th, 2021. According to my estimations, this equates to roughly 451 working days and one of the longest ever investigations into alleged breaches of the broadcasting code. And so in this episode we are going to consider Ofcom's final response to the one complaint that merited a full investigation, and their extremely revealing reasoning as to why over 600 complaints did not. Family law barrister Sarah Phillimore will be offering her expert view on the credibility or otherwise of Ofcom's findings.
It's absolutely barking.
And ultimately, it's up to you to decide what this all says about Ofcom's own commitment to impartiality and the need to avoid direct sex discrimination, gamma and political bias.
Alright, gentlemen, let's do this.
They dragged them out of their bedrooms, kicking and screaming.
Why can't you come with us?
Because the police officers say I can't, sweet. It's the court that say that you can't. It's definitely not our decision.
The whole premise of the documentary was flawed. It was to give this impression that, women who dare speak up about violence, that's it. Their children are taken from them at midnight. Absolute nonsense.
The narrative promoted by the programme makers was primarily built around a highly sympathetic hearing of 8 cases involving allegations of domestic violence against fathers from mothers engaged in private family law custody disputes.
We have to talk to as many people as possible from all sides of the story to try and give viewers a picture of what's going on.
95% of fathers are the non-resident parent outcomes of the family courts, okay? Yet, they didn't find one father of the 95%, and there's 44 to 48,000 applications every year to the family courts. That's Kafka's immediate justice figures. They didn't find one father who was alienated. They didn't find one father whose children were taken from him on holidays, taken from him by the police and brought back to the mother's house because she made allegations against them. They didn't find one father whose child had repeatedly jumped off a balcony, breaking a leg, an ankle and a kneecap to try and escape from an abusive mother.
Back in September 2021, the Glass BlindSpot considered the reasons why Channel 4's portrayal of the family court system had generated so many complaints. We also documented the testimony of expert witnesses who provided valuable perspectives on a side of the story that was noticeably absent from a noticeably one-sided documentary that could perhaps best be described as a hit piece against fathers, and more broadly against victims of a form of domestic abuse, commonly known as parental alienation.
So they're coming in, they're giving this so-called expert advice around parental alienation, and I say so-called because we've looked into some of these experts and they have very vague titles, they're not affiliated to any regulatory body, and that concerns me.
And for an oh-so-serious programme that communicated some oh-so-serious concerns about the credentials and credibility of some so-called expert advisors, it was surprising to learn about the breadth of concerns about the credentials, credibility and impartiality of some of the expert testimonies that Channel 4 did permit to be broadcast into all our homes.
They showed in dispatches a video that had been filmed by the court said people at Parliament Square. I know because I was there. The headline speakers were among the most renowned child abusers in the UK, as found in court this was part of Channel 4 Dispatch's documentary, as if they had filmed it, as if the court said was respectable professionals with impartial professionalism.
There is absolutely no child protection in the UK. Only child trafficking, child abusing paedophile rings, running amok in every town and city in the UK. The secret family court has passed its sell-by date and is way past reform. The court needs closing and the judges need to be deposed.
We don't go out there and collect data, we're creating data.
I think what's misrepresented in the programme is it says, I think Dr. Barnett says there's just no research to say that these work. And I would refute that as complete misrepresentation.
We're regulated by Ofcom. We have to be fair and balanced.
I have met Louise Tickle several years ago. I saw exactly what she was about. I had no interest whatsoever in any further meeting with her.
I mean, I just wondered if she'd actually done any research. And I think she's kind of taken the path of least resistance and maybe followed her own ideological thoughts rather than, I think she really missed an opportunity.
It's such a big mess, but it doesn't help, does it, when you've got people in positions of power and influence like the Victims Commissioner, you know, coming out so decidedly on one side of a polarised narrative. That isn't responsible at all. It's very dangerous.
Sarah Phillimore has been working in the family court system for considerably longer than the self-identifying glam feminist barrister Charlotte Proudman, who spoke to Dispatches about the appeal cases. And by the way, as highlighted in a previous episode, this is the very same human rights barrister and junior Cambridge research fellow who once publicly applauded the assault of two men on her college campus.
Say what?
Anyway, after a year-long assessment process, Ofcom announced that one of the complaints they had received warranted an investigation under Section 7 of their broadcasting code. And in a curious twist to a tale commencing with concerns about gender bias and a misrepresentation of fathers in family court disputes, it transpired that the one complaint progressed to a full investigation had been lodged by one of the mothers and her now adult age son, whose experience of a court-ordered police removal was featured prominently in the episode.
I'm gonna kill myself. The child's gonna kill himself. What's wrong with you?
You must be a total psychopath to think that removing a child in that state is for the good of the child. If it has to be done, it has to be done because the judge said so. That just shows everything that's wrong with the system.
In their case, it was actually the father who was the resident parent at the time of the traumatic removal, and the mother and son's perspective on this matter is that he was using forced removals as part of a pattern of parental alienation to disrupt the son's already limited relationship with his mum. This crucial context went unmentioned, and consequently they complained that they had been treated unjustly on the basis that Candor Productions and Channel 4 had exploited the son's suicide attempt and the extreme distress heard in the broadcast audio as a commercial hook to support a political narrative that had no relation to their situation. Regrettably for them, Ofcom disagreed. The one thing I will say about this finding is that I'd be inclined to agree that their story was misrepresented, at the very least to the extent that after watching the portrayal of their experience, I for one had been left with the impression, or perhaps given the documentary's narrative momentum, had simply assumed that in their case the mother had been the resident parent when her child was forcibly removed from her home by a family court order and made to live with his father. Anyway, I'll leave a link in the show notes to Ofcom's full finding, which in May of this year marked the conclusion of their considerations of complaints about shocking media bias and the misrepresentation of fathers in family court disputes. A conclusion that may very well leave you wondering about what exactly happened to all those complaints alleging gender bias and a misrepresentation of fathers in family court disputes. Well, to most effectively answer that question, we have to circle back to October 2022 and correspondence the Glass BlindSpots received from Ofcom in response to a number of questions put to them after a single line in the August edition of their broadcasting bulletin confirmed that they would not be conducting a formal investigation into a total of 604 complaints alleging that the Dispatch's documentary had been materially misleading. So, strap yourself in, folks, and maybe get out your reading glasses, because attention to detail is highly recommended when considering the substance of Ofcom's, in all fairness, surprisingly detailed response. They advise that Ofcom does not, as a matter of course, write correspondence with the outcome of our considerations. However, on this occasion, in order to assist, we set out a summary of our reasoning for not pursuing the standards complaints in respect of this programme. The Broadcast Standards team assessed whether the content in this programme raised issues warranting investigation under the following rules of the Ofcom Broadcasting Code. Rule 2.2. Factual programmes or items or portrayals of factual matters must not materially mislead the audience. Rule 5.5. Due impartiality on matters of political or industrial controversy or relating to current public policy must be preserved on the part of any person providing a service. In relation to Rule 5.5, they noted that broadcasters are required to ensure that neither side of a debate relating to matters of political controversy or current public policy is unduly favoured. In Ofcom's view, the subject matter of the programme was not a matter amounting to political or current public policy, to which the special impartiality requirements apply. They therefore found no issues warranting an investigation under Section 5 of the Code. In relation to Rule 2.2, they noted that Ofcom guidance explains that whether or not a programme is materially misleading depends on factors such as context, editorial approach, the nature of the misleading material, and above all, what actual harm or offence has occurred. We considered the programme included a variety of voices to provide alternative views and further information on the issues covered in the programme. We therefore did not consider the concerns raised by the complainants provided grounds for considering that the content was materially misleading.
How you can produce something like that and not speak to a single father. It's just incredible.
The narrative promoted by the programme makers was primarily built around a highly sympathetic hearing of 8 cases involving allegations of domestic violence against fathers from mothers engaged in private family law custody disputes.
Did you think the fact that he had a conviction for sexual assault against minors would be the end of it?
Well, it was, yes. Yes, I did. I feel that our case was so black and white.
Once again, I'll leave a link in the show notes to their full reasoning. And once again, you may still find yourself wondering what exactly happened to all those complaints alleging gender bias and a misrepresentation of fathers in family court disputes. Because, as you may very well have noticed, Ofcom's response is entirely silent on this point. And based on their own description of their broadcast standard team's assessment process, they have clearly ignored these crucial aspects of many of the complaints that they received, because to have done so, they would have also had to have assessed whether the content in the programme raised issues warranting investigation under paragraph 2.3 of their broadcasting code. In applying generally accepted standards, broadcasters must ensure that material which may cause offence is justified by the context. Such material may include discriminatory treatment or language, for example on the grounds of sex, sexual orientation, and marriage or civil partnership. And based on their own reasoning, they did absolutely no such thing. The closest I got to an answer about their assessment or otherwise of over 550 complaints alleging gender bias and the misrepresentation of fathers in family court disputes came in an initial email from their communications manager that I received in advance of the submission of their full and final response. She advised that when we receive complaints, we don't ask for personal details beyond name and contact details, so we can't accurately say that these complaints have been made by fathers or on behalf of fathers. Now, on the one hand, I guess that's fair enough as far as it's fair enough, but it is almost entirely irrelevant because their procedure clearly provides complainants with the option to submit a summary and description of the nature of their complaint. More definitively, Channel 4's public response to the complaint coverage specifically sought to address the allegations about gender bias and the misrepresentation of fathers in family court disputes. And besides, 1 year previously, the very same Ofcom communications manager had advised me in writing that the nature of the 550 plus complaints received at that point could be succinctly summarised as objections to alleged gender bias and the misrepresentation of fathers in family court disputes. Anyway, before I leave you to make up your own mind about what this all says about Ofcom's own ability or otherwise to prevent gendered conscious, unconscious or gamma bias from corrupting their ability to effectively investigate breaches of content standards, I invite you to consider an assessment of these findings by our expert witness, Sarah Phillimore. For the uninitiated, Sarah is a family law barrister with over 20 years' experience. She regularly contributes to the wider debate about child protection systems and is also the co-founder of Fair Cop, who are a campaign group dedicated to upholding Articles 8 to 11 of the European Convention on Human Rights and removing politics from policing. And I began by asking Sarah what she made of Ofcom's reasoning for not investigating that grand total of 604 complaints.
Well, I just don't understand it. The letter sets out the Ofcom guidance definition of matters of political or industrial controversy and matters relating to current public policy, because those are the issues that you have to be balanced about. And it defines it. Matters of political industrial controversy are political industrial issues on which politicians, industry and or the media are in debate. Matters relating to current public policy need not be the subject of debate, but relate to a policy under discussion already decided by local, regional, national governments. So that's the definition.
Yeah.
It seems absolutely clear and unambiguous that the documentary fell within that definition. And yet right after the definition, the letter says, in Ofcom's view, the subject matter of the programme was not a matter amounting to political or industrial controversy and or a matter relating to current public policy to which the special impartiality requirements under Rule 5.5 apply. Discussion around parental alienation was not the subject of legislative debate at the time the programme was broadcast. I mean, this is just a nonsense. That isn't even their own definition, isn't it? It doesn't have to be subject to legislative debate. It's a policy under discussion or already decided. I mean, this documentary was quite clearly produced with a view to supporting what the campaigners were trying to do with regard to the Court of Appeal decision in Re-HN. And it led, directly leading to the Domestic Abuse Act. How can this be anything other than political? The dismissal of parental alienation is a political campaigning tool. We've seen that because it's been used to demand that the rights of men who are merely accused of abuse, not convicted, not found to be abusers, may not cross-examine their accusers. So it leads directly to the qualified legal representative scheme, which appears to be a complete nonsense and falling apart at the seams because it can't get anyone to join in because the rates of pay are so low. I couldn't understand that at all. I didn't understand the reasons they gave. The references to parental alienation with the programme were made in the context of its examination of decisions made by the courts. Yes, demanding that these very courts were reformed by the political system. It's absolutely barking. I didn't understand it at all. This was a political documentary making a political point that the family courts were terrible and needed to be reformed by politicians. I don't understand why this isn't deemed a matter of significant political controversy. But there you go. So that's what the letter said, but I don't understand it.
Yeah,
I know also they don't know who Sir James Mumby is. I don't know who this Sir Lawrence Mumby case is. It doesn't instill you with great confidence, so they can't even get the name right of the former president of the family division, where this Lawrence came from. I mean, that's a minor point compared to their definition nonsense, but it still doesn't instill one with great confidence about their proofreading or really any initial care they took.
Well, Yeah, in terms of the quality of the response, the very fact that the complaints that they're actually referring to, because kind of by this point, obviously they had started an investigation into a mother who kind of participated in the program, but the complaints they were referring to that they took over a year and a half to decide not to investigate for some reason, which strikes me as a very long time. Were about gender bias and misrepresentation of fathers in family court disputes, and they have completely ignored that, or they completely missed that. They don't appear to have taken that into consideration at all.
The whole debate was swirling around the Domestic Abuse Bill, which became the Domestic Abuse Act. I mean, I don't know the exact timings as to what stage it was at when this documentary came out, but I revisited my blog post on the matter, and I can see it seemed to be quite clearly a multi-pronged attack on the family justice system, along with the Court of Appeal decision, then this documentary, and then the next year, the Domestic Abuse Act becomes law. How can this not be political? It's saying the family justice system is a failure, and it's hurting women. It's a tool of misogynistic oppression, and something's got to be done. The law's got to be changed. Well, that's politics, isn't it? Am I missing something? Am I being really dense? Discussions about changing the law are politics, pure and simple.
So, do you think it's incompetence on Ofcom's part, or do you think there's an element of political bias?
It's just really strange. Like you say, the fact they don't mention any of the gender bias. I mean, that was the huge and obvious flaw with that documentary. It did not appear to make any efforts to speak to any fathers, and thus presented just simply a one-line narrative that the family justice system abused women and didn't understand domestic violence and rewarded violent men. So obviously they weren't going to talk to any fathers who would tell them about how horrible it would be to be on the wrong end of parental alienation. So that doesn't even get a mention in the letter is really curious. I don't know. I think there are parallels with the gender wars. People who think that they are right don't bother to look beyond their noses or analyze anything because they're right.
Yeah.
They disregard or they distort any evidence which does not support the view that they are right. So all I can imagine is the person carrying out this investigation started off from the premise that there was absolutely no problem. It was just a bunch of angry men complaining, and everything flowed from that. I mean, I saw that with Social Work England's investigation into Rachel Mead. No attempts at any intelligent analysis of what was going on. You start from the assumption this person is wicked and everything flows from that. You don't actually look at what's in front of you. So somebody has to come in with fresh eyes and say, oh, no. So clearly, I can only imagine that there was nobody able to take that fresh look at it.
Which leads us to kind of the second area, which is that they did take forward a complaint by a mother who didn't fit within the narrative that, or who felt very much kind of misrepresented by the narrative. So I mean, in terms of that finding, would you say it's fit for purpose? Based
well,
on
I'm less troubled by that for this reason, that both, I think, the mother and the son expressed themselves happy with the documentary in the days after they'd seen it. So it does seem a bit weird that they suddenly then turned around and said, you utterly and completely misrepresented us. And I do think that was pretty sly of the documentary to do what they did, because as I understand it, to the casual viewer, it would seem as if this woman had been falsely accused of parental alienation and her child was removed because of that false accusation by a violent man, when in fact she was saying parental alienation is real, it's being done to me by the father. So, I mean, is that worthy of huge censure? I don't know. It's definitely skating close to the edge, though, isn't it, of sacrificing what's actually happening, the truth, for dramatic effect, which I know documentaries have got to be entertaining, but it's a grey area, isn't it? I was less disturbed by their response to the mother and son because they had accepted that the documentary was well, they said good. Actually, the mother was positive about it, wasn't she? So I'm not quite sure why she would then change her mind. But I agree that it was disturbing that they weren't clear, isn't it? But they saw it just through one lens, didn't they? The misogynistic oppression lens. That's why no fathers were interviewed. And that, in and of itself, is a really strong indicator of bias and partiality. And it's dealing with a political issue because they were calling for changes to the law. So I think Ofcom were wrong to respond in the way that they did to the complaints. The mother and son, it's a bit more of a grey area, isn't it? It does look as though they signed a release. The release was quite clear. I still think it was sneaky not to make it clear what the situation was. But, you know, they didn't misrepresent it. They just were silent as to it. So it's kind of sneaky, but I don't think anywhere near as bad as failing or refusing to interview any fathers who were victims of parental alienation. I mean, that was a huge hole in it. And there was such a good discussion that could have been had about, well, why can't the courts help these parents navigate the system quicker and better? Because we all know what the problem is, that these cases drag on for years. So a little seed of parental alienation is a mighty bloody oak tree by the time you get to the end. That's the problem, not that the courts are too stupid or corrupt to notice domestic violence. No. You know, courts are very hot on evidence and proving things. It's the whole thing with the gender wars as well, isn't it? This polarization of views, it just wastes everyone's time and energy because nobody's focusing on solutions. We're just all fighting our own particular corner. And it is very depressing to see a publicly funded broadcaster getting involved with that. I mean, it's kind of one side. I mean, look how much time and energy it's wasted with people complaining, being rejected. All this energy could have been going into something productive. So it does make me really cross because it's not journalism, it's campaigning. There's nothing wrong with being a campaigner, but do not pretend to be a journalist while you're doing it, because that, I think, is very misleading.
Yes, ultimately the thing that struck me most and why I wanted to sort of work on this program was because it was so blatantly biased. It was so blatantly biased.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you've probably said it all. I mean, I guess the final question is just in terms of kind of whether there's anything we can learn from this experience and from this broadcast. Does it give you worry about the state of Ofcom? Is this something that you think sort of this is something that just people get away with it all the time, or is it particularly?
It just makes me worry about the human species because I see this everywhere. I used to think naively that all we had to do was talk openly and honestly and we would solve the problems. That is not true. That was utterly naive of me. And what I know now is that people are tribal. They adopt a fixed position, they adopt it early, and they are then utterly resistant to any evidence which counters that narrative. It's further corrupted by people having financial rewards and professional rewards tied up with pushing the same narrative. So, Women's Aid will get funding for being Women's Aid. They're not going to get funding if they turn around and say, oh, well, maybe we ought to be looking at the role of fathers in the courts. I don't know why it's all gone so horribly wrong, but it's everywhere. You see it in politics, journalism, the whole gender debate. It's almost as if people are utterly terrified of being wrong. And I like to think I'm not terrified of being wrong. I'm really glad to be wrong because it means I'm learning something. So my whole identity and sense of self is not tied up with whether or not I'm right, because I don't see it as a shameful thing to admit a mistake. When the facts change, my opinion changes. I mean, that's that used to be how we did things. I just don't understand. We're regressing really quickly. And it's not just the family justice system, it's everything. We're all going to suffer for this. So I am feeling, really very bleak about this. There doesn't seem to be any room for nuance because I think people have just got their whole sense of self tied up with I am right. And a lot of people, of course, bringing their own past trauma to it. I am right because I suffered this way as a child, therefore everyone else has. I don't know what it is. There's no ability to step back and take a holistic view and take on board various different views, everything becomes polarized really quickly. I mean, at least with the parental alienation, is it real or isn't it? You're not going to get sacked from your job or investigated by the police for having a view on parental alienation. Not yet. That may be coming.
Yes.
But, even with the gender debate has been so utterly corrupted because we didn't even have that freedom. Any slight mockery or criticism, and literally agents of the state were coming down on you like the proverbial ton of bricks. It took me 3 years to fight off the police, cost nearly £50,000. And so, what's going on in the family justice system is nowhere near as bad. We can at least have these debates, although they're, quite bad tempered and people are quite rude, but people aren't in fear of losing their jobs. Although there are some worrying signs that that's happening. Because I know, didn't you get a complaint about you?
Yeah.
Or something awful? Yeah. So, maybe it is happening and I'm just not noticing it.
And in my case, somebody went through hundreds of hours of my, kind of broadcasting, and thought they had something and they didn't. But I think more broadly than myself, the likes of misogyny, hate crime laws, for example, I think that area of transphobic is more wedded within the legislation already.
Maybe I can offer a slight beam of optimism. It should be horribly ironic, but you see, a lot of the campaigners like Proudman have really taken their eye off the ball of what this gender identity thing is leading to. Because if anybody can be a woman, then all of this special protection for women that they are advocating for will fall away. And men in these proceedings are going to start saying, actually, I'm a woman too. It sounds absurd, but it's the logical extension of where this is going to go, isn't it? So it's very curious to me that very often the campaigners in the domestic violence sector are very much in favour of gender ideology and support their trans sisters. They don't seem to see the train that's coming down the tracks and why women like me are so worried about it, because once anybody can be a woman, being a woman has no meaning.
Yeah.
And all of these special protections which are geared towards women, if anybody can claim that title, what does it say? So I think this is quite an interesting blind spot they've got. And I can see that maybe that, ironically, will be what derails the whole thing. Who knows? But that's the train that's coming down the tracks, isn't it? It's all a bit depressing, isn't it? I think we've just got to keep on keeping on. I mean, I would end on a message of hope. As far as I can see, the courts are not buying anything that these campaigners are selling, and they are simply carrying on and doing what they've always done, which is robustly look at the evidence. And the interesting thing is the reality of what's happened to finding of fact hearings after H&N is, ironically, the courts have been pushed even harder not to have them. And they've been told, you must look at the impact on the child's welfare. So this isn't going to be an inventory of decades of a hideous toxic relationship. This is about what directly impacts the child. So in a number of cases, I've had courts being really robust and saying, no fact finding, it's not relevant. The behaviour you're complaining about was 5, 6, 7 years ago. You've allowed contact with the child since. No, we're not doing this. And I don't think that's what the campaigners wanted. So as far as I can see, the courts, the judges are pretty impervious to all the political noise. And hopefully that will continue.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.